Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, this is getting near the end of this detailed build series, and we're going to finish wiring up the output tubes and the RCA jack and the volume control and get this thing ready to power up in this video. This is kind of the last of the real detailed part of this build. There are a couple of components left to put in, but that's not a huge deal. I kind of go over that maybe in the next video after we check the voltages. So let's get to building. Okay, so we got our input tube and phase splitter all wired up, and again, since we're using so many pins, basically every pin on this tube, it's really hard to make this thing look really neat because you got resistors jumping across everywhere, and you know, it's just, this is about as neat as I think you can make it. And so that's not something to be too concerned with. You guys know I like making things neat, but I've just learned these dual triode input tubes, they're real difficult to make look like super neat. So anyway, moving on to the output tubes. This is our plate, which is going to connect here. This is the screen, which is going to have the screen resistor going from here to there. So the output transformer main lead hooks here. The ultralinear tap hooks up here. This tube here is going to be for the grid of the output tube, which is this pin right here. And then the coupling capacitor goes from here over to the plate. And then the cathode of this tube also has a coupling capacitor that runs over to this other output tube. This is going to be the positive side of the push-pull. So the blue leads will hook up here, and the brown leads will hook up here. So now we can come over here, get these wires out of the output transformer. And they're going to connect across like this. But I think I'm going to wait to hook those up until I get the rest of this tag strip populated. We need to get our 2K screen resistor and put it from this tag strip to the screen. So let's find that resistor. So it's going to go in here like this. And then the second one's over here. I'll come in and trim off the excess. Then the next one is just a jumper that goes from here to here. And it doesn't really matter what color wire you use. Things like this, I just use whatever color I seem to have a lot of left on my spools. The red and the black get used up fairly quickly, so we'll just use a blue piece of wire here to connect that up. And we'll solder that up. Then we'll put this one in. And solder it up. The next piece is we're going to have a jumper that goes across between the cathode, which is this pin here, and our tag strip. And then this is our grid wire. So I'm going to go ahead and bend this over a little more just to get that out of the way. And again, we're going to be connecting, going to go a jumper from here to this terminal, and then this is our grid. It's going to have a 1K resistor that goes from here to that tag strip point. So let me make up another little jumper to go here. Then we'll put our resistor across there. And we're getting real close to having the output tubes wired up. So we have our little jumper here, and I'm going to put the screwdriver under there to hold that up. So it's up at the top part of this little terminal, which keeps it away from the grid wire. And put this one in. And the same thing, put a little screwdriver in here, solder this end. And then the last piece we have is the 1K resistor that goes between the grid and this terminal. The grid and that terminal. So let me find those resistors. Come on. Use our little screwdriver here to kind of hold that in position while we solder it. I want it towards the end of this little deal, and we're cheating a little bit here. I've got a whole pile of these 1.1K resistors, and the value of this resistor isn't critical, so we're going to use some of these up. And since this is like a grid stopper resistor, we're going to put the resistor as close to this pin as we can. And while that's not absolutely necessary, that's just a good practice to use when you're doing like grid stopper or screen stopper resistors. As you can see on this one, we got the screen stopper resistors pretty close to the pin too. So another really tight fit in there, but that's okay because we want it to be really close to the pin if we can. I'm going to bend both those over and then trim them off. And there's our output tubes all wired up. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to bring these wires from the output transformers over and connect them. And solder this one up. And there are those two connected. And now we're going to connect these two over here on the other side. And then solder these two up. So now we've got everything connected up. The last thing we need to do before we power this thing up and start checking voltages is to connect our cathode resistor from here to the ground and then put in our two cathode bypass capacitors. And I think what I'm going to try on this channel, since we've lowered the plate voltage, is put the 270 ohm resistor that this design calls for, and then measure the voltages, and then see what our current draw is through the tube, and see if it seems reasonable, or at least where it's not going to melt the tube. And then we can do an analog discovery 2 audio analyzer suite analysis of one channel versus the other, with one of the tubes running relatively cool and one of them running hotter, and see if there's a difference in the performance of the two monoblocks. Okay, so like I said, on this channel or this monoblock, we're going to install these 270 ohm resistors that were in the original schematic. And with the lower plate voltage, I think we may be okay, and it's at least good enough for testing this theory that changing the cathode resistor and the current going through the tubes will change how they perform and their power output. So we're going to run with this and just see how it does as an experiment. And as we experimented with the other transformer and had issues, and I was saying, wow, I should have breadboarded this. Did I learn anything? Absolutely not. We're not going to breadboard this. We're just going to build this thing like this is the final production thing. And another thing we're going to try that I've never used before is some stuff called thermal tape. It looks like this. And I'm going to cut off some pieces and apply them to the underside of these cathode resistors to not only attach them to the amp, but hopefully have some thermal transmitting qualities that will help transfer the heat from these cathode resistors from the underside of the amplifier up to the top of the chassis. So let me trim off a piece of this stuff, apply it to the bottom of this resistor. It looks like that. Stuff super thin. Get the dolly hair out of the way. And this is going to go right there. Push it down really good. And wow, it's just nailed down. So using this, it'll avoid having to put like screws through the top of the chassis through these holes, and will also help conduct the heat. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 deal. And I know while it's not the perfect heat conducting material, I've seen this type of stuff used on computer parts that, you know, are pretty hot running. And so if it works on them, it should work on this as well. And the way these solid core wires are, they kind of help hold these resistors in place. And so they're not like just hanging from this tape. The solid core wires are going to help hold them in position as well. So we'll put that one right there. Let's stick that one down. And there we go. There's our 2 cathode resistors. The next thing we have to install is the 470K grid leak resistors. And if you remember on the other amp, these were the ones I messed up and put 1K ones in. So we definitely got the right resistor this time. And let's put a little PTFE tubing on these. And the other thing to understand that as we lower the value of this resistor and we run more current through the amp, it will also lower the plate voltage as we'll see more voltage drop across the rectifier tube. So this may end up being just fine. So this guy goes from here to there. We'll bend that over and around. And then cut off the excess. And do the same over here. Over here. Bend that around. Put it there. Bend that around. And mainly we're doing this so we don't have to worry about this resistor falling out of place while we're trying to solder these terminals that have multiple things connected to them. Here we go. So I'm gonna do my little trick with my screwdriver there, holding that in the right position, and solder this joint up. And do the same over here, and solder this joint up. And the last piece we have to put on these output tubes is going to be our cathode bypass resistor. And again, in this amp, we're using some nice quality audio note capacitors. I feel like this is one of the positions in the amp of using less than high quality capacitors can result in a loss in sonic quality. And I see people talking about, bypassing the cathode capacitors with film caps and stuff, trying to make up for using cheap capacitors. And I'm more of the opinion of, well, just use a good electrolytic capacitor to start with, and you don't have that problem. So I bend it up like that, put some little hooks on the ends of the leads. Make sure you're putting the negative side toward the ground. Crimp these little guys in place. so they stay put while we try to solder them. Then come in and solder these last two joints. And then do the same for the other capacitor. And solder these two up. And there we go. The last little piece we have to do here is connect the RCA jack and the volume control to the input tube. And that's important because those components comprise up the grid leak resistor for the input tube, which it needs to operate correctly. So we don't want to power the amp up until we have some path to ground for the grid of that tube. So we're going to go ahead and just solder up all this final input tube stuff. And so we've taken the jack here, we ground this down to the brass so it gets a good connection, a good solder. We're not trying to solder this silver or whatever this stuff is. And then we put a little flux on here. And now we're going to heat this up. And this takes a little while to get this hot enough. So you want the solder to melt as it touches the body to know that it's hot enough where the solder is really getting a good connection. And then we come in here and take this wire that we're going to be connecting over to the potentiometer and lay it in the puddle. And there it goes. And what I normally do is I get the end of the wire tinned, and then I go ahead, put some solder on this part, and I come back and heat it up, put the wire through, and then we have our connection. And when you're done, it'll look like that, all nice and soldered together. So let's install this jack and start running the wires over to the potentiometer. Okay, so we got our jack installed. This is the positive lead. This white-red wire comes up and over to this terminal on the potentiometer. This ground wire comes over from our tag strip over here up to this other side of the potentiometer. And then it comes through this wire down to the ground on the RCA jack. Here we have a 1 meg resistor, which I put in my amps as a safety resistor in case the potentiometer, for some reason the wiper becomes disconnected from the rest of the potentiometer circuit. There's still a path to ground for the grid through this 1 meg resistor for this ground lead to the center terminal, which is the wiper. So we're going to solder both these sides up. Then we're going to run a 1K resistor from here to the grid of the input tube, and the amp will be done wiring, and we'll be ready to power this thing up and test it. Then we'll come in and put our final resistor in. And of course this last one is going to fight me, but I'm not going to let it win. I'm going to try not to let it win. Like normally I would do this with it sideways so gravity wouldn't fight me, but then I couldn't record it on camera. So this is part of the fun I go through for you guys to show you this work in real time. I'm trying to keep this stuff on camera for you. I don't even know if you could see that, but this is the resistor I was just soldering in. It's got the little PTFE tubing, and then this other end comes up to the potentiometer. Bend this over so it'll stay in place when I try to solder it. And this should be the last solder joint in this amp. Oh yeah, still haven't put the coupling capacitors in. Knew I was forgetting something, but this is enough to, now I can power up the amp. I can check the voltages on all the tubes, make sure everything looks good, and then once it does, we'll go ahead and run these coupling caps across from the phase splitter over to the output tubes and be ready to put this thing on the audio analyzer suite. So first we're going to check the voltages, then I'm going to solder the coupling caps in, and then we're going to start putting this thing on the scope in the audio analyzer suite and see what the difference is between these two amps with the different cathode resistors. Well, we're close to wrapping up this second monoblock, and I think this one turned out really nice. Well, the other one did too, but hope you've enjoyed this more detailed kind of build series. And the next video, we're going to be powering it up and checking the voltages, and then putting the last few components in, and then hooking up the feedback loop, and then we're going to run it on the audio analyzer suite and on the scope, and then compare the two monoblocks to each other. And I hope I can do all of that in the next video. Link below is where you can buy the PC board version of this amp if you want to build one. Thanks again for Tubelab for putting this design out there for everybody to enjoy. And hope you also will check out my links below on some of my cool stuff that I use in my builds, like my soldering station here and some other things that, PTFE tubing and a few other things. Anything that you buy through those affiliate links helps me out and helps the channel out. So anyway, again, I hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe. Please like the video. And we'll see you soon. Have a nice day.